it's like money is almost like it's an accelerant, perhaps not a cause of happiness. And so if you already have a propensity to be happy, if you're happy like right now today, then more money is more likely to make you happier. And so maybe what we need to focus on more than, how much money we're making is how can we be happy to begin with, right? The relationship, it's definitely non-linear. Like it's really complicated, and it's actually quite interesting, I think.
You like comedy, obviously, right?
Yes, I do.
I have a theory that comedians are better philosophers than people who study philosophy.
Interesting. Okay.
Because
Tell us more, yeah?
the number of times I've gone to like a comedy show or just watched comedy, and it's made me think deeper about different aspects of life it's far too many to count, right? Whereas I guess keep in mind, I've never had the opportunity to speak to, a philosopher by trade, but I think there's something to the fact that comedians are just trying to make you laugh. And, there's this saying that there's always a little bit of truth in every joke.
Very much so, yeah.
I feel like the truth really comes through with a comedian because it's just joke after joke after joke. Okay.
I think this is a good point. And I think also, in order to be a good comedian, you also have to notice a lot about how people think and act and like their motivations. Like I think that's quite often what a lot of these jokes are about. Is like, like people thinking the wrong way or doing the wrong thing, or circumventing how people think. And so that kind of lends itself to philosophy. I think you're onto something here. I think this could be a paper. You should write a paper.
Well, honestly, it's if you think about it, I think comedians are just so funny because they say what other people are thinking. Even if obviously, I feel like now most comedians, to actually get attention, they have to say things that are quite, over the line in different aspects of anything, politics, race, religion, everything like that. But the thing is, people still laugh because I feel like people are still thinking about that these comedians have a remarkable way of storytelling and verbalizing. Right? Which
and
actually
people
brings
think
me
that by themselves too.
Yeah, but they just don't say it.
They just don't admit it, exactly.
And this brings me, like, I was on a I don't know. Okay, so for the past couple of weeks I've been pretty lazy at work. So in my free time, I just watch comedy on YouTube. And I've been on a big Chris Rock train for the last little while. Okay.
Okay.
And I came across one of his skits. This is very old, like circa 2010. Okay. Like back, or I honestly, even before that, like 2005. And he said something really, really like hilarious, but it actually made me think. He said something basically along the lines of this. If Bill Gates were to wake up one day and he saw that he had the same amount of money as Oprah, he would jump out the window and kill himself. Both are like billionaires, right? But obviously Bill Gates is like a centibillionaire, whereas Oprah is just,
pedestrian,
a meager billionaire.
Yeah. It's just
But it made me think about this idea of and I brought this up in my recent class with my university students. It's like just this perspective that all wealth and all money, like the amount of money that you make and can save, there's no objective amount that will ever almost represent a finish line of what you're working to. It's always just relative, right? There's always going to be someone richer than you or making more money than you, right? And I don't know. I just when I, if you were to hear that, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Or what do you think about?
Yeah, I feel like there's been a lot of discussion about this, even like in economics and in those like psychological circles, the fact that it really is very relative, right? Like it's not one of those things where you can just kind of pick a number and then once you get to the number you're good. Like I do feel like there's a lot of adjustment people make as they kind of go along. And I even think back to like some of the times when I was like broke and I'm like, those are some of my happiest days, like
Right?
when I was in university and all my money was going to pay my school fees. And it's like, those are some of the best days. Like it's interesting how our relationship with money, I think is different from even how we think it is. Like we almost haven't really bridged that gap between how we think and how we actually feel about money.
Yeah. I feel like you're onto something there. Why do you think you were particularly happier and life was great when you were a broke, starving student?
I mean, I wouldn't say I was happier than I am now. I would say that I was I was objectively happy. I think in a way that like is a bit surprising when I look back at it because like there were times when like for example the first month after I paid my school fees when there's nothing in my account. But at the same time I guess it was because of just everything else that was going on. Like there were fulfilling experiences, I was making friends, I was doing all these other things. And so I guess my point there was more about the fact that the money wasn't really necessary for the happiness. Like even without it I was still able to create these like really memorable and beautiful moments. And so then the question comes back to okay, like how necessary is money for happiness? Like obviously there's a threshold beyond which or below which it doesn't. You need money to be happy. Like if you can't pay your bills, if you can't do whatever, like there is a limit, a lower limit that's I think fairly a lot easier to identify. I think the question you're asking, which is a much more interesting question, is like what is the top limit? Like at which point does money have no additional marginal influence on you being happy? I believe if I'm phrasing your question correctly, that's kind of the discussion, right? Like where is this top level after which it doesn't matter or something along those lines.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think also, to discuss any level of how much should you be working towards trying to make, call it on an income perspective. I guess yeah, let's talk more on an income perspective. So call it how much you can make on an annual basis as opposed to a number in the bank account, like how much you've saved. If you think about how much, you need to be making on an annual basis to be happy, I actually think, and I think you would agree, that the answer to that question is actually different than the amount of money you need to be making to be satisfied,
Yes. Yeah. I agree.
right? I think satisfaction in this realm could represent, call it the lower limit that you'd be
Mhm.
working towards, and
Yeah.
happiness could
That's a low
be
bar. Yeah.
some upper limit that is very difficult to be objective or to objectify,
Fair.
right? So how would you what would you say is the difference between happiness and satisfaction?
Ooh. I guess just kind of the way you just phrased it, I think would be quite close to the mark. I think satisfaction really is that point of not having any additional like needs versus happiness is no additional wants. I feel like that might be a way to think about it that is in my brain right now. So when once your needs are fulfilled, then you can be satisfied. But happiness fulfillment comes from then having your desires satisfied as well, not just like the base level. It does that. How does that sound to you?
Yeah. Yeah,
And
I
how
think
would
that
you
makes
describe it?
sense. I think yeah, I mean similarly, I think satisfaction has a synonymous um connection to, let's say, something like contentment or fulfillment,
Hmm.
whereas happiness has could be more synonymous to, call it pleasure or or growth. I don't know. I think satisfaction could lend to more numbers that we can pick and choose, right? And then we can
Hmm.
measure our way to that number, whereas
Hmm.
happiness would be more of a moving target that seems to just keep moving as we get closer to it.
I also might actually say that the satisfaction is probably a bit more. even spread along the population. Like I think most people have a similar lower bound. I
Mm,
think the lower bound is probably a bit closer, but I think the top bound of like how to actually where people get where people get happy, I think that varies quite a lot with respect to this conversation about income. So I think that the
income.
lower bound is probably there's less variance in the lower bound than the top bound. I think the top bound is like it can be insanely huge. Like where does someone actually get happy? Like I think there's more variance there than on the lower bound.
Okay. So so what do you think are the factors that go into actually defining the number that is the lower bound?
The lower
Like
bound, okay. The lower bound is
what
interesting.
are the things? Let me rephrase that question. How much money does it take to be satisfied and content, and what are the factors that go into defining what that number is?
Mhm. This is interesting. So when I was thinking about this, I was trying to wrap my head around like what the actual spread is of incomes within just since we're in Canada, it's within Canada, right? So that's kind of where I started. And I think the median mean income is somewhere around the 50,000s. And so my initial conception was, okay, like if you can reach that level, then you can probably be happy. And then immediately I noticed that like that can't be right because if it's a median or the mean, it means that about half of the population is below that. And
Right.
I don't think you need to be like at that level to be happy. And so I immediately realized that like it's a bit more complicated than just like finding this one number. I would say that in my estimation, it would be essentially enough that you can have a living space that you're happy with. So like if you have a family
Hmm.
of three, a one bedroom, probably you're not going to be happy with that, right? But if you're
Right.
single like me, I have a one bedroom and I'm very happy. Like I'm chilling. I'm chilling. So yeah, so
Okay.
I think based on your circumstances, it's going to depend. It's going to be how much it costs to basically create just a healthy life for yourself and your loved ones. So that's the housing, the transportation costs. Like if your monthly car payments are stressing you out every single month and you're scratching your head when the insurance payments come, then I think that is probably not a level that you want to be at. So I would say that once your living costs, your transportation costs, your food costs are good. Basically, all these the basic needs, the lowest level of Maslow's hierarchy.
Yeah.
Actually, the lowest two, right? So I think safety and basic needs. That would be basically the level of satisfaction I think everyone kind of needs. And then I would also add on just a little bit of leisure. I think we all need some leisure to be happy. And so whether that is the gym memberships, the Netflix, being able to go to the movies with your family, being able to travel once a year or something like that, like I think that's the level where we start talking about like, okay, this is the base of satisfaction. It's not just, being able to pay your bills. It's being able to pay your bills and also being able to spend meaningful time either with yourself or with your loved ones in the ways that you find attractive. And I think that's where the most variance comes in is in the leisure time because some people are happy staying at home and binge watching Netflix or going to like a video game convention or having game night with the bros at home. Whereas some people need to travel, right? So I think that's
Yeah.
kind of where a bit of that variance comes in. But I do think it's not a huge window. Like I feel like that's maybe a couple $100 difference per month between the lowest and the highest. I think it is my estimation, my very rough back of the napkin calculation. Um, how did you approach this question? Like how was your what was your thinking when you were considering like what these bounds are?
All right. So I would say that the equation for calculating the amount of money that you need to be just baseline satisfied, in my opinion, is probably, the actual number that you need to obtain the resources to keep you safe and content, right? Plus the amount of money that you need to buffer your potential anxiety around not having enough money. So, like the sense of security. Plus, I think there has to be a component or an amount of money to allow you to be personally content with the amount of status that your income would signal.
Mm, interesting. Okay.
Right? So there's three components. Number one is basically what you hit on, right? Is just how much you need to be safe to cover all of your basic needs and resources, aka the lower parts of Maslow's hierarchy. Plus, call it a little bit of contentment that comes from a few leisure activities that are, necessary and actually required for probably most people's mental
Hmm.
health and sanity. So that's probably the first component that I agree with. But then there's also a second component that is, this amount of money that you need to buffer any sort of anxiety that may come up from not having or not making enough money, right? So I would say this is something like, okay, I'm probably okay with all of my the money and all of my expenses and all the things that I spend on now, but I'm thinking about potentially having kids or starting a family in the future, and I might need some more money for that. So that's sort of anxiety that may stem from things like that, right? Where there's this thing of, oh, I'm okay right now, but actually in the future, if I want to live the life that I actually am wanting to, the level of money that I would need to satisfy all of my baseline resources would actually be needing would
Hmm.
need to be higher. So there's some sort of anxiety around that. So I think that needs to be a part of this equation as well. And then I think naturally, because we are evolutionarily programmed to play these status games in, call it, our tribe, I think there needs to be an amount of money that needs to almost just allow you to be pretty satisfied with the signaling that may come from that. Even other people may or may not know, but just,
Hmm.
for example, like, if the average business school graduate from a Canadian university earns whatever, $60,000, you may not need $60,000 to live, right? And cover all of your resources for, being safe and content. However, you might still need to get to that 60 because that
Hmm.
signals some sort of almost just like status points to say, okay, now you are on average, or maybe you might need even something higher than that to signal to yourself that, okay, you're content because the status that you can obtain from earning this amount of money is actually higher than average, and therefore you are okay and you're progressing with that, right? So I feel like the idea of satisfaction, contentment, if it's defined as contentment and fulfillment, I think you need to have components above and beyond just safety,
Hmm. Hmm. This is amazing.
right?
This is a very financial advisor answer view, because I realized I hadn't really considered much the psychology aspect of things,
Mm,
and that is so key. That is so key. I think first of all, the anxiety was a really good point, and I think also this status thing, because I feel like a lot of us would say we don't care about that stuff, but like a lot of us do. Like I think it
yeah.
really is, like you said, it's built in. Um, that's a really good point. And so I guess when you mentioned the anxiety and the future planning, basically like thinking like in the future I need a certain amount, and so that's going to affect how much you need today. That also includes then things like retirement savings and things like that as well, right? So
Yeah.
there's also an aspect of how much are you. It's not just how much you're bringing in, but also how much you're putting away for a rainy day. And that's part of the buffer you're discussing, which I think is also a really good point. That's great.
Yeah. And I mean, you made a good point earlier that it will differ from person to person, right? Because we naturally have different levels of anxiety around certain things. We have different upbringings or internal scripts around money. So I think the number in terms of how much money you need to be making to be satisfied, to factor in A, safety, B, contentment for things that you want to do, C, a potential anxiety about the future, and then D, the necessary requirement of status you need to gain. I think all of those need to be a component of it, and all of those will have different numbers depending on what level, kind of what am I trying to say, what natural state or temperament you may have.
Mhm, mhm. These are all really good points. Yeah. I think it's fluid between people and also within people. Like I feel like depending on your psychology right now, your philosophy right now versus in 5 6 years, I think it's going to be very different. Like I think
Hmm.
at some point, I feel like you've probably come down a little bit, right? Like I feel like the number for you has decreased in the last few years, I believe, right? Like the top level at least, and that's just one of those things where as you grow, as you age, as you change relationships with yourself and with other people, like it is one of those things that changes, and so it's like it's this weird multi-dimensional number. It's not just like this is the number. It's actually really complicated and depends on so many things. So yeah, we're not going to be answering the question today, but we'll be talking about
Oh
it.
yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, that's like most of our podcast. We don't really I feel like we just discuss questions rather than hone in on exact answers, but
Yeah.
that's what I like, right? Um, bringing that point, I think over the course of the last 7 years, building the number of just financial plans for the people that I've worked with, and naturally the people who I work with are, I would say, above average income if you look at the average income of $50,000 a year or whatever it may be. And most of the time, especially earlier on in my career, I was optimizing for, you know, just like A and B, right? Just the level of safety and then the contentment. And then I think as the years have progressed, I've added in this, that the third component of the anxiety that may have. Like, here's a perfect example. There's pretty much every single client that I work with,
Mhm.
they're every single annual review that I run with them, one of the things that I do as a good financial advisor is I ask them, do they have any more money to throw into their accounts or investments, right? Are they sitting on any cash? And most of the time they're like, yes. However, I just like having 10 grand in my checking account every like whatever. I just
Mhm.
like seeing that. I don't like going below that. And then so over time of like, okay, that is, and this, keep in mind, this is, even with a fully funded emergency fund, they've got all their insurances in place and everything like that. But it's like their baseline is not zero. Their baseline is that 10 grand. And I would say that 10 grand represents, that buffer of anxiety that may have. And some people
Mhm.
have it 20 or 30 grand or whatever it
Yeah.
may be. And I
Okay.
think even intrinsically me too, right? I would say naturally I'm way more conservative with my finances than the average of what I've seen, right? But and I think that's just naturally because of my scripts and temperaments of my upbringing and things like that, where I've just naturally skewed towards needing needing larger buffers to manage that sort of anxiety. Where do you land on that? Do you tend to be more, the type of person who needs larger buffers to manage anxiety, or are you pretty easygoing with like letting it run and seeing the zero in your checking account and stuff?
I would say I'm getting more and more conservative as I age. I think a
Yeah.
younger me was fairly gung ho, but yeah, I having seen things that can happen, and how quickly things can change. Like there was a study in the States that said like some people are, or I think it was, I saw like 30-ish% of people are like two surprise $1,000 bills from poverty, like from not being able to make rent, from not being able to like do a bunch of things like that, and it's just like that's a scary number. And like when I really look at how things can happen in life, like the surprise that can come can be very concerning. And so yeah, I think I'm getting more and more conservative. I think my baseline number is fairly high compared to where it was, let's say, 5 years ago when I was in university. Yeah, was it 5 years ago that I was in university?
Yeah, something like that.
Something like
It's been 7,
that.
yeah, since for
That
me.
number's getting too big. That number's getting way too big.
Yeah, it's almost a shame, isn't it? Like when you're younger, you have this beautiful ignorance of all the emergencies that can happen in your life, and therefore
Mm.
you're like, "Oh, it's fine. I've got 3 shifts this coming week, and it doesn't matter if I have, $41 and a lollipop in my checking account." And it's like it's so funny as you I think a part of it too, as you grow older, you start to realize that, okay, if you want to I feel like if you want to contribute any sort of value to the world, there has to be some sort of dependence where other people are depending on you, whether it's your coworkers, your clients, your boss, your family, or things like that. And
Mhm.
that comes with this level of responsibility where it forces you to be less ignorant to all these potential emergencies and concerns that may pop up in your life, right? But
100%.
you know, I think that I actually think it's pretty easy to figure out right? The number that you need to be
Mhm.
just safe. I think
Yeah.
you were alluding to that earlier, that, the baseline the baseline coverage of most of your expenses to be call it in a semi safe neighborhood, whether it's renting or buying, plus being able to afford groceries at a, you know, cheap to medium level grocery store, um, and being able to cover kind of all of your meals and the
Mhm.
occasional, call it night out or dinner or something like that. I'd say that's fairly easy to calibrate based on your jurisdiction, right? Geographical
Yes.
jurisdiction, right?
It's a good way to put it. Yes, exactly.
But I think the other aspects being, the anxiety buffer combined with the necessary status signal that you need for yourself to say that, okay, you are progressing in this world to avoid any sort of depression. um I think those are different from person to person, right? So if we were to look at that being a quasi formula for being satisfied, where does the how does the challenge change when we look at what is the income needed to be happy?
So now this is getting to the top bound.
Yeah, this is, I would say, looking at the upper end of how much is enough.
This is interesting. So there's so much research about this because this is the question, right? Like I feel like the reason we're talking about this today, the reason why this is so talked about is because there's no goal. Like, because I mean, technically, there's no upper limit on earnings. Like naturally, there kind of is, but I mean, you can make obscene amounts of money. Um, and I think we see it all the time where even the richest of rich people just aren't happy, right? So there's definitely that point where it stops, like the marginal utility kind of goes to zero. And it's interesting. I was reading this study the other day, in preparation for this episode. Oh, I was sorry, I wasn't reading the study. I was on YouTube, and the guy on
Yes, of
YouTube had
course.
read the study.
Abel reads studies day in and day
Yes.
out in preparation for these
Yeah.
complex philosophical episodes. Yes.
Yes, yes, yes. But no, like they linked the study. I did click on it and I scrolled through a little bit, but it wasn't like for my own leisure. And so they mentioned how I think there was a study once upon a time that showed that above, I don't know how much, it was somewhere around the 100,000, above making $100,000 a year, individually, or I think it was like 140, in a household,
As a
like you and
household.
your spouse. I think essentially what study was saying was that above that point, like any extra dollars give approximately zero additional happiness. Like if you survey people on the whole income spectrum from like around 50K to like 140K plus, there's a point at which where like the graph is almost horizontal. It's not exactly horizontal, but it's almost horizontal. So it's like you can work your ass off to like double your salary from 140 to 280, but the happiness from 70 to 140 is massive, but then the happiness from 140 to 280 is like much 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 smaller. So it's like basically it's a curve that kind of like cools off a little bit. However, there was another study that was done, and this was the first study was by Daniel Kahneman, and then there was a different study that showed some differing information. And so Daniel Kahneman and I keep saying like I know the guy, but like it's doctor, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
And so him and the author of the other study, they kind of came together and they did a joint study to like really dig in. And what they found was that, and this is going to sound obvious a little bit, but I think it's still interesting, is that the level of happiness a person starts at, um, really, really impacts how much happier they can get afterwards, right? So, like, let's say you're in the 50th percentile of happiness, and today you make $50,000, and then there's another person who's at like the 75th, and there's another person who's at 90th, right? So 50th, 75th, 90th, and then if you if those people's if those people's income increases, their happiness all kind of increases, starting at about 50,000 and going upwards. But then there's a point where the less happy person stops being happy with more money, even though it's the same amount. So, like, if you were less happy to begin with than a person who's earning the same as you, because happiness is also a spectrum, right?
Yeah.
And so, if there are three people, Mr. Happy, Mr. Okay, and Mr. Sad, and all of their incomes increase like together in step, basically by $10,000, $10,000, $10,000. I think it was around $80,000, $90,000, where like the happiness for Mr. Sad kind of like tapers off. Like more money doesn't increase it anymore. Whereas for the happiest guy, the person who started happy with lower income, their happiness just keeps going up. Like more money keeps making them happier. And
Oh.
so there's a relationship with like your current base rate. So I think just like your base psychology impacts your relationship with money and how much money can make you happier. It's like money is almost like it's an accelerant, perhaps not a cause of happiness. And so if you already have a propensity to be happy, if you're happy like right now today, then more money is more likely to make you happier. And so maybe what we need to focus on more than, how much money we're making is how can
Mm.
we be happy to begin with, right? Like I think that's also part of the conversation. But yeah, the relationship, it's definitely non-linear. Like it's really complicated and it's actually quite interesting, I think.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I have found that when it comes to these sorts of studies, because I've seen, the popular one that a lot of, that's very popular in the financial advisor space is like the Harvard study done, where it's like 75K and then
Yeah.
130K,
Yeah.
75K
Yeah.
for an individual and then 130 per year for a household. And then the marginal gain for any dollar above and beyond that is significantly less, right? I don't
Yeah.
think it actually ever gets to zero. I think the you still get positive
Hmm.
benefits from
Hmm.
earning more. However, you don't get it. It never really flattens to zero until you actually get into significant, crazy amount of wealth, and then it actually becomes negative.
Okay. But it's just it's a much less
Yeah, yeah. Yes, it
it's steep.
curves.
The slope decreases.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And the one thing I always have to think about, or I always tend to think about in these sort of studies, is the date, right? The date that the study was done. I do believe our environment and our world changes so drastically year over year that it's very hard for studies to be relevant. I think they do age out of reality. Okay, and this, there's this actually makes me think of a study. So I think it was back in 2023, so about 2 years ago, CNBC did this one study where they just surveyed a bunch of Americans and they asked them, how much money would it take for you to feel like you are rich, right? And hands down, the most common answer was $1 million a year. Okay, that was the most common answer for,
Jeez.
in terms of how much would it make for you to feel like really rich.
That's a
Okay,
lot of money.
right? Yeah,
That is
it
an
for
absurd
sure
amount of
is a lot of
money.
money. And here's the crazy thing: so if you were to take that number, the $1 million a year, and adjust it for inflation, and if you were to go back to 1990, so adjusted for inflation, that would mean that you are earning about $250,000 in 1990. Okay, adjusted for inflation.
Wait, it happened that fast?
Yeah,
Like
yeah, yeah, okay, okay.
that's nuts. That
Yeah,
it's
yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, inflation is a ridiculous force on money itself. But adjusted for inflation, $1 million earned per year in 2023 was equivalent to $250,000 earned in 1990. Okay.
Mhm.
And that being said, if you go back to 1990 and think about how many people in America actually earned $250,000 a year, it was like 600,000 people, which out of
Mhm.
250 million people.
Yeah.
Okay. So now, that being said, the most common answer for how much money it would take for you to feel rich back in 1990 would have been equivalent to the top fraction of 1% of Americans. Okay. I think over time, our understanding of what it takes to feel rich has been just so exponentially skewed upwards. And I think that's a very important thing to keep in the back of your head when you look at these studies, especially even if they're like 10 years old, right? Because 10
Mhm.
years
Mhm.
old, adjusted for inflation, that $1 million a year would be like, call it $600,000 a year, right? So I think our environment that we are in just shows us how relative money is rather than how objective any level of income is, right? And I
Mhm.
think
No, that's a great point.
because now we live in a society and where our environment dictates so much of our understanding of what it is to be rich, it actually doesn't surprise me that people define rich as something that is actually statistically only achievable by the top fraction of 1% back in 1990. You know? And it's funny because there's this really interesting there's this common saying, like this quote that I always come back to. Um I actually bring this up a lot when it comes to just my day-to-day work because, naturally my clients tend to be basically dialed up versions of me in terms of like how aggressive they are with their pursuit of money. But I always say this, like, it's like, um, you know, if you like, if you want to be happy in life, it's actually pretty easy. But the problem is that most people don't want to be happy. They just want to be happier than others. And the big issue is that other people always seem to be happier than they actually are. Right?
Yep.
So if we tie that together with money, it's like we don't really want to be rich, right? We just want to be richer than those relatively around us and our environment. And I think over time, as we get more and more exposure to more than just the people who are around us, right? Our idea of rich is just exponentially increasing because now you've got 16-year olds dancing on TikTok making $1 billion a year. So I don't know. I think it's a very interesting thing, um, which to be honest, it doesn't really help, but it
Mhm.
it helps put it into perspective.
Yeah, it's so much of life is just like trying to avoid this comparison trap, and I feel like so much of real life is not being able to avoid falling to the comparison trap. And I bet that like also the $1 million estimate per year. I'm sure part of that is like people not having enough time to think about it. Like I'm sure none of those people
Mhm.
really sat down and like did the math. Because man, $1 million a year is a lot of money. Like that is an absurd amount of money. Like that's truly like, is that 1%? That's approaching 1%. I'm sure. Maybe not, but like that's up there.
Well,
Um,
now it's not. Like now it's if you think about all Canadians,
mhm.
that's, I think there's whatever 10% of retirees have whatever $1 million in assets or whatever. But
I don't know, but we're
yeah,
talking about
no,
like
it's
income, right? Like at some point, your
income
income
per
is
year.
much. Mhm. That's
Yeah, that's
nuts.
disgusting. That's
Like
an
I understand
insane
if they say
amount of
having a
money.
million in the bank or in a mix of investments in the bank would make sense, but yeah, like a million a year, my goodness. I feel like 160 a year for one person is like plenty. Like that's a
Yeah.
good amount of money to be like you're good. Like you can travel, you can buy a nice car, you can do whatever you can buy a house, you're good. Um, but yeah, no, so that's really interesting. Your perspectives on this are really different. I feel like the fact that you talk so much about money makes this um a more unique conversation than like a lot of them that I see online, right? Like because you this is literally your life. Like you
Oh
you
yeah.
deal with this on a day-to-day basis, right? Have you noticed any trends at all in like the clients that are happier with themselves, with their situations versus, and I don't know if this is even allowed to be spoken about, by the way, but like, yeah, no, is there anything that you've noticed? Like, are there any patterns in like personality or in how they approach life or how they think about things that make them happier?
Yeah, I've definitely seen the differences between I'm I would say that it's very easy for me to understand the type of environment that someone is in based on their monetary desires, right? So, for example, if I work with a couple, right, a couple who is, call it 35 to 40 years old, and they're both working full time jobs. They're both earning, call it above $80,000 a year or like a $200,000 household. They both work in large organizations with, let's say, one of them are saving in their long term retirement savings, another one has a pension through work, and they work with, yeah, large organizations. I find that those individuals are the ones who would be more likely to say, oh wow, whenever I run their projections in retirement, and especially if they're saving diligently and working with yours truly, they in retirement, it's very exciting to tell them, no, you're actually going to get a raise in retirement. You're actually going to be able to make more money in retirement because you're saving so much, and you'll have these many assets because we've invested it, compounded over time, and then the passive income you can generate. It's like very, very easy for them to quote unquote be quite satisfied with the way that their financial situation is going.
Mhm.
Whereas if I work, I would say probably 50 to 60% of my clientele are, either lawyers or doctors. Okay. So call them one person businesses where, they have no upper bound in terms of the amount of money that they can make outside, like above and beyond the amount of time they can put in. Right. And I would say those are definitely the people who would be like, you know, if you made $1 million a year, how would you feel about that? They would be more likely to be, oh, yeah, I guess that'd be cool. You
Yeah.
know? And
He
I
said, "Why
think
not
it's
2 million?"
mainly, yeah, I think it's mainly because their environment is surrounded by little bits and pieces of their potential, if that makes sense. You know, like a 33-year-old lawyer, okay, at a large corporate law firm in Canada, especially if it's one of the bigger firms across Canada, a 33-year-old, call it seventh year associate, would be earning about a $250,000 a year. Okay.
Mhm.
And then the next year, seventh to eighth year, they make partner. And then a partner will usually start at about 350 a year, right? So that's a big 100K jump.
It's
But
huge, yeah.
then the partners who are also called partners at their law firm, who are just 5 years older than them, are making 800K a year, right? Because each year they accumulate more and more shares and units in the firm, and then that just they get paid for every unit that they own at the end of the year, right? And so, you know, I would say that our bracket of comparison tends, in my experience, usually ends up being in the range of, call it, people 10 years younger to 10 years older. So it's like a 20-year gap of of a 20-year gap that represents the majority of the people that you compare yourself to. So for people like doctors or lawyers, someone who is 5 or 6 years older than them could be making anywhere from 2 to 3 times as how much they're making right now. Whereas someone who is working in a big company, not in an executive position, but call it I would say an upper middle class, someone who is 5 or 6 years ahead of them may only be making whatever 20 or 30%
Yeah.
more than them,
Mhm.
right? So I would say the first thing that I do in terms of when I try to connect with a prospect, especially, is to try to understand their psychology and what are they striving towards. And a huge component of that is really figuring out what environment they're likely going to be in, right, over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. And it's always nice to come across a doctor or a lawyer, um who's like, oh no, you know what, I'm pretty good right now. I'm making 350 a year. This is good. I'm in my dream home that I'm going to be able to afford to live in, and I don't really care to put in the extra 4 hours a day of work to make double this, right? That's always nice, but I would say that's definitely few and far between.
It's a rare case. It's interesting. And so it comes back to the same thing, right? We're just basically saying that it's not about like who was it that said it? Was one of the classic philosophers who says like, happiness doesn't come from satisfying your desires, it comes from controlling your desires. Like it's like if you can decrease the things that you want, that's when you'll be happy. It's not really when you can satisfy all the things that you want.
Oh
Which is
yeah,
actually
yeah,
much more
yeah.
attainable, which is
That was Naval. It's he says that, but then he also follows up with, "It's easier to obtain your desires than to renounce them."
Come on.
And it makes sense, right? Like, I mean, going back to kind of what I mentioned earlier, right? We are 100% evolutionarily programmed to constantly compare and constantly drive to earn more, acquire more resources. For hundreds to thousands of years, the human race was in an environment of scarcity. And, our brains are evolutionarily programmed to optimize for survival and reproduction. And there is no aspect of contentment or being okay making and acquiring the same amount of resources you do now for the rest of your life. There's no part of that is in line or aligned with our evolutionary psyche.
It's unfortunate, but I think I have to agree. Although, I think more than ever, there are more people who are kind of having discussion in a meaningful way, right? So
Mm.
I do think there's more around this than there has been in the past. And I think, I don't know if I'm willing to make the statement, to like sit on the statement fully, but I think it's easier. I don't think it's easier to like satisfy your desires. I think it's clearer how to. I think it's just that the path there is clearer, but I do think like the work required to really like lock in with like what you really want, and like not what you want because of vanity and what you want because of status, but I think the things that really really apply to you. I think the work to like understand what that is less than the work to let's say 2-3x your income for most people. But I think it's just because historically it's been de-emphasized, and I think even today like it's a much fuzzier path. Like it's kind of like
Yeah.
the one way is like really nicely paved and you can directly see like the steps you need to take, versus the other one is like winding and the steps aren't exactly clear. So I do think that that is also a part of it. It's just the fact that decreasing your wants is something that like no one really talks about. Like how often is that really a thing? Like, unless you're a Buddhist or a Taoist or something, I feel like there's much less emphasis in general media on kind of controlling and decreasing your wants, and so it just becomes a bit more like the default is to go and get it as opposed to like to do the internal work. So I think that's also a bit of a factor.
Yeah. And it's funny that you say that. In preparation, I would say, of thinking about this discussion, I just randomly I did like a social thought experiment where I went into my social media accounts, okay, and I factored in some of the marketing emails that I get to,
Hmm.
and I calculated it to be that roughly 80% of the stuff that is in my feed or in my emails is leads to some sort of messaging that I am not making enough money.
Yes.
Right? And I think this is a self-fulfilling prophecy, because for anyone who may be even slightly remotely similar to me, where a part of you believes that you could be doing better or you could be making more, I think because of that, the algorithms that are surrounding us and that we are exposed to just magnifies that. I feel like any aspect, if you I would say all of all of your happiness ends when you type into Google how to make passive income.
Yes.
Because that
The thing is, you don't
springs
even have to
out.
type it in. It just comes on your story sometimes. It's like
Yeah.
sometimes it comes to you.
But do you know what I mean? And the funny thing is, this isn't just always, it's all marketing. Yes, I would say 90 to 95% of marketing is literally all about telling you or showing you how you could live a more status filled life, right? Where you could get, it's drilling into that evolutionary programming. But even, man, even in terms of social media, just coming across other people's feeds and posts, you're like, oh shit, they just they just bought this massive house, and I'm
Yep.
still
Yep.
renting this place that I'm in right now. It's like, it's not necessarily marketing or advertising that is the culprit here. It's just naturally the way that everything is positioned around you. We
Mhm.
are in this constant state of of inadequacy, right? We're living in this constant messaging of inadequacy.
Yeah, and I feel like there's also the point of you'd mentioned, how for hundreds and thousands of years our brains have kind of like been evolving to make it this way, but we didn't have access to like this much information until so recently. Like for most of human evolution, we were in these small communities where there really wasn't like, the gap between me and Elon Musk and how much money he has. Like that's just
Yeah,
that didn't exist. And so like the fact is that now we have this access like you were talking about, and we have also like the concept of inadequacy in a way that I don't think we were meant to have. Like I think, the pursuit and the dissatisfaction was kind of built in for a good reason, but I don't think it was built in with this in mind, right? Like it's kind of, we're using equipment that's a little bit outdated, talking about our brains here,
yeah,
in this environment, and it's just like it's really hard. Like it's tough to not want things because yeah, everywhere you look, you just see people doing things that you want to do, or things that you want other people to see you doing. Like there's all these weird interactions now that like social media and comparison is just like the primary way. Is it would you say it's a primary way we interact with a lot of people these days is by comparing ourselves to them? I feel like that might be worth a discussion at some point, because I think social media is increasingly a large part of our interactions with humans, and I feel like social media is primarily comparison, or largely, or yeah, I think a big chunk of social media is comparison. So that's interesting. It just occurred to me, but I'm not sure about it. But I think it is a bigger part than it used to be, perhaps.
yeah. I would say that's. I mean, one of the intentions of social media. I would say it's always been a part of the dopamine that triggers in your brain comes from a little bit of inadequacy, right? Combined with a little bit of curiosity. That being said, that stems the question: is there a way around it? So recently, actually, ever since I did a little deep dive on my social media to calculate this, I've been on purpose trying to watch and click on more like funny memes or like cooking videos or basically stuff that just that makes me feel quite content, and hopefully I'm working towards these algorithms
Yeah.
um to help me feel that. You know what, in personal self-reflection, and I'll ask you this, in personal self-reflection, I think I have taken reasonable steps forward in this area that I would say for the majority of my adult life I've struggled with in like, okay, say, uh, leaving leaving something on the table, right? Or just like not not continually being caught up in this need to continually obtain more, call it resources. I think I've taken some strong steps forward, and that's been a combination of the reasoning has been, a combination of factors with, the people I surround myself with, and the habits that I'm focusing on and things like that. So I would say naturally I'm quite happy with the progress I've made in that sense. But what about you? What would you say, where would you say you're at in terms of the spectrum of being satisfied and optimizing for the upper bounds of happiness?
Mhm. I think I have a similar answer. I think over the last few years, I've kind of been able to narrow in on what the limits are. I think I say limits because naturally, for any specific income that you want, there's like a specific amount of work you need to do to get there, right? Like there are sacrifices to be made to like get there, and so my thinking is often about that trade-off, right? Like what is the marginal utility between the work and the result? And so a lot of my thinking in the last couple of years has been in considering like, okay, where does that point come where I'm not willing to give up, for example, like you kind of mentioned earlier, like a few more hours of work for X amount more income, which is in itself like a really difficult calculation to make because these things are fluffy and difficult. But I do think that my number is a lot lower than it used to be. Like I used to think that it would take a lot of money to make me happy, and now I'm realizing that like it's much less about that. Yeah. So I think I'm much
Mhm.
closer to the experience side of things. And I'm much closer to that number than I thought I could get by this age. Like I think we're approaching it. And I think by like my mid 30s, like I'm almost guaranteed to hit it. Um, which is exciting. I think for me, the big emphasis really comes from what I'm doing, what work I'm doing, like what I'm producing, and less, not specifically like in like a day to day, like what the shareholder value kind of thinking,
Yeah.
but more on the other side. I think we've spoken in the past a little bit about how I would like to like dedicate a large part of my life to some sort of charitable effort, and so
Like
um,
altruism.
yeah, exactly. That really that means a lot to me, and so I think there's more optimization on that side for sure. Like I think I'm falling much lower on that side of the equation versus on like the income side. I think on the income side, I'm fairly content with where I'm at right now, and based on what I'm looking at the next few in the future, and I actually did a pretty good job of saving last year, which kind of came as a mistake. What I realized was that I did the thing that all the finance people recommend. I mean, I was already doing it, but I upped my automatic monthly investments at the beginning of last
Bang.
year,
Huge.
and I completely forgot about it completely. And then I did my review at the end of the year, and I'm going over these accounts because it's like separate accounts that I never even look at. And I'm
Yeah.
like, oh shit, yeah, this has been a good year. So, yeah, I think the gap right now for me, for happiness, it's not really on the income side. It's more on the what am I actually doing? Like why
Mm.
am I put on this earth kind of side of things. So, yeah, that's my current. That's a long answer for a simple question, but yeah, that's where I'm at.
No, yeah, I think you're onto something there. That it reminds me of this. I don't know if it's like this old Buddhist or Hindu saying around, you know, it's like one of the greatest skills in life is to get up and walk away from the table when you're still a little bit hungry.
Mhm.
I think that there is this immense difficulty to resist this temptation to go faster than possible or to go as fast as possible to exploit all of your opportunities. And I would say, these are obviously champagne problems that we're dealing with, because it's a place of luxury to be able to have opportunities and things like that. But
Yeah.
I think there's something special about going, you know, going slow in whatever pursuit, including income and money. There's something quite remarkable about it, because just the fact that you're going slow, it creates this long-term modest state of hunger that just keeps you going. I think there's a natural aspect of fulfillment that comes from growth and pursuing growth. And I think it's nice when you're in a situation where you're going at a pace that if you were to look at yourself, and you may consider fast or whatever it may be, but there's something nice about going slow and steady, right? It also reminds me of this other saying of, I think Chris Williamson says this, of how, there's three people on a ladder. There's one at the top, there's one in the middle, and there's one at the bottom. And who's the happiest? And the answer is the one that's climbing,
Mhm.
right? And I think if you have some aspect of your life where you are climbing and going as slow as necessary, I think that creates freedom in a lot of other areas of your life, which would lead to significantly greater amounts of overall happiness than if you were to climb faster.
100%. 100%. And honestly, I think that even like one of the key things to get to that place is also just taking an actual investigation of what your thoughts are. I think that to go back to the initial question that you asked, or sorry, an example you gave earlier about asking people on the street how much money will make them happy. I
Mm,
feel that's kind of how a lot of people approach this question, and they just kind of like the first answer is the answer. Whereas I think like when you do an investigation, you really sit down and engage with the question. I think that by itself is just a huge benefit because there's so much to be learned from when you really pay attention to your thoughts in that way. So I would encourage everyone to really just sit down and just do an actual review. Like, like what are the things in the last year that really made me happy, and how many of them were actually related to my income, right? And what are the things that I wasn't able to do that are really related to my income? And I just feel like the fluffy, insanely high numbers, um, that could be you. Like maybe you are the kind of person who needs $1 million a year to be happy, and that's totally okay. But I feel like fewer people need that than actually like realize it. And I think thinking you want that, even though you don't want it, is also like what's going to cause unhappiness. I think that if the expectations are at that level, and even if you're somewhere where you could be happy, or if somewhere you could be happy
Mm.
is closer, I think that could also like cause more anxiety, less happiness. And so, yeah, I would just encourage everyone to like really just sit down and really sit down with the question and take it as seriously as possible. Take like really what do I think? And I think that could lead to some interesting insights.
Yeah, for sure, more positive insights that could help you escape a lot of these natural traps that your environment might be exposing yourself to. Because the happiest people, in my experience, aren't the ones who have more; they're the ones who have enough, right? But, anyways, yeah, that was. I think that was a good discussion.
Yeah.
I think I don't think we answered the question, but that's okay. And yeah, I don't know. I think it's given me a lot of things to think about for sure.
The answer is 143,000 household income. That's the answer. I felt it. I just felt it.
Oh,
There you go.
143 household income. That's a good income.
Yeah.
Could do a lot of things with that income. Unless if you have 7 kids, that might be tough.
Can you ever be happy with 7 kids though? is that even an option?
Who knows? Who knows? Who knows? Depends. How was the week? Any fun or interesting things you came across?
Yeah, this was a cool week. Lots was happening this week. My favorite thing from this week was probably that over the weekend I went to the Salon Auto de Montréal. It was a car show.
Ooh,
Um,
nice.
when I was a young man, I was a big car guy. I remember back in like my mom's house in Kenya, me and my brother would just have like, because we shared a bedroom, because as many people do their brothers, and above our beds we just had like these cutouts from magazines of all these cars. And like one
Nice.
of our favorite things to do every week was to go through the classifieds and the car ads and stuff and just cut out the cars. Because yeah, we
Mm.
were both car nuts growing up. And so I hadn't been to a car show in a long time. And then this came up on my Instagram. Shout out to the algorithm. And yeah, man, it was incredible. So many cars. It was just a massive, massive, massive display. More Ferraris in one room than I think should be legal. Like there must have been 25 plus, and they all belong to like this one company called Poirier. I think I don't know what they do. I was wondering, what do you do with like 40 Ferraris?
40,
And I don't think
40?
there were rentals. What's that?
Did you say 40? 40?
Yeah,
40
yeah,
Ferraris.
yeah, yeah. And they were all owned by one company, so I assume some of them get rented out to like VIPs and things like that. But I can't imagine. Like they were all there. I'm like surely this is obscene. Like this, who allowed this to happen? um, so that was really interesting. They had a couple of rooms with like really custom built cars, like things people did things to these cars that also shouldn't be allowed. Like there was this one car that had a bottle of Grey Goose on display in the trunk, and it had next to the bottle of Grey Goose there was a TV. It felt like Pimp My Ride. There was a TV with a Nintendo plugged in, like a Nintendo DS. And it's just like I don't know what's going on here, but I love it. And so yeah, I went out there with my buddies, and yeah, it was a really fun day. We were there for like 5 hours. It was crazy. I know that was that was my Sunday.
Nice.
How
That's
about you, man?
hilarious.
What have you been up to?
Nothing crazy, man. Okay, so I mean, in Winnipeg, here it's been roughly about 40 below with the wind chill, and this is Celsius, for the last week or so. So it's been pretty miserable. I'm not gonna lie. It has been brutal, and it's been taking a big toll both on Sophie and I. And I think mainly just because we thrive on our walks. Okay, walks are a big part of like our both of our lives, and getting some steps in or just getting movement. And you know it's like we go to the gym, but we can't go to the gym like every morning and lift weights. Otherwise, it's just it starts to take a toll on you, and it's just not the same, as
Yeah.
a nice peaceful walk where you get to talk and stuff. Most of the time, I'm yelling at her under the bench press to keep pushing weight in the gym. But no, I mean, if you can see in the bottom right here, that is a new treadmill that just came in today.
Oh, nice.
It is currently not assembled, so I think I'll be spending pretty much my entire weekend trying to assemble it. But I think
The entire weekend.
it will, dude. If you saw this, I'll send you a picture after. It is It is a behemoth. It's a
Okay.
Nordic track, okay?
Okay.
It's a Nordic track, and this will stay with us for the rest of our life.
Fantastic.
But I think there's something to when you're in a little bit of a rut, whether you're feeling lazy or not motivated or something. It'll be good for both of us who currently are right now working from home. It'd be good to just whatever, just run for like 10 minutes on a treadmill
Mhm.
or throw on a YouTube video and just move the body a bit. So I will
Question.
report back. I know of many people who have also purchased treadmills, but basically they're just overpriced coat hangers
Yes.
instead of actually doing what they're supposed to do. But I don't know. I think I'd be pretty diligent on that. But it's tough when you can't go for walks or even just get
Yeah.
any movement and you're just staring at screens and fluorescent lights all day.
Yeah. And this is the pits. Like the next 6-ish weeks into late February are going to be like, that's when the seasonal affective disorder really takes its toll. There's nothing to look forward to. There's no Christmas, and it's just cold as hell and dark as hell.
Yeah.
So
Well, there's
I think
Valentine's
it's a good
Day.
purchase. What's that?
There's Valentine's Day.
What is that? You know what's funny? I have an excuse
Yeah.
every Valentine's Day. It's my sister's birthday, so that's
Oh,
that's
okay. Okay. So you
that's what I
can't
do
do
for
anything.
Valentine's Day.
That's why. Yeah. That's why.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
You're not going to
Shout out to
have
my sister.
any big
I had a
plans on
question.
that day. Yeah.
And so this treadmill was bought to solve a specific problem, which was the fact that you guys can't walk together anymore. Will you be using the treadmill together? will, will you be either side by side or front and back on the treadmill?
No, I'm gonna
No.
basically be on the treadmill and she's gonna be beside me. There's gonna be a leash that is just basically
Okay.
buckled to me as I'm walking. And it's
Yes.
basically like she's just gonna be walking. No, you're right. We need to get a second treadmill to be
Okay.
beside this one.
I would love to see what makes more sense between side by side on a treadmill or front and back. I have a vision because if it's front and back, then you have to like also take the same steps, and I just think that would look really funny. Like, can you imagine
Yeah, you
just
need
like,
to take small steps. You can't
and then
take
you need
full
to like time
strides.
them. It's gonna be like an army.
Yeah.
I think that would look really
Bas-
funny.
Basically us in
Yeah,
the gym,
yeah.
step by step. Yeah. Anyways, this has been great. For anyone who is still watching or listening, we do definitely appreciate your time. If you have any thoughts or comments, leave them down below. How has our viewership been or listenership been? You're on that
Mm,
side of the visibility.
I would say the same as it has been the last couple of weeks. Like the shorts are still crushing it, and
Oh
I
yeah.
have noticed a bit more pickup geographically in the listens.
Oh
It's been interesting. Yeah, I feel like the pipeline is kind of like, I guess, just warming back up since we're back to
yeah.
promoting it. And yeah, so I think Instagram, about,
Yeah.
and yeah, the shorts are still killing it.
Yep.
I need to look at the TikTok. I haven't looked at the TikTok enough, but yeah, that is going to be
TikTok.
interesting.
Yeah. Man, this is crazy. I think this is so weird about like the YouTube and TikTok algorithm. It's like if there's a signal that, almost cements what we've talked about this entire episode, uh, the any short or reel that where we talk about money in some capacity just does exponentially better than the other stuff.
Hmm.
Everyone's so this episode is needed. People need to listen to this
Yeah,
episode,
everybody feels
even though we
inadequate
didn't
or
answer
something. Yeah,
anything.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I feel like in general though, like if we just to about that comment, I feel like the question is almost always more interesting than the answers. I feel like this is the case for everything. And even if we take like, I think you used a superhero metaphor at some point in the last few weeks. Was that you?
Superhero?
He's like the hero's journey.
Yes. The hero's journey.
Yeah, but that's the thing. Like on the hero's journey, once the hero accomplishes the goal, what happens? The movie ends because that's not even interesting anymore. Like once
they stop
the
climbing.
conflict is over, yeah, exactly. And so it's like, I do think that there is something to be said about how the question is almost always more interesting than the answers, and the best answers bring more questions, right? So I think there's something to say that. But yeah, that's I like it. That's
cool.
all.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Okay. Well, cool. I hope you have a good rest of your week. We will touch back next week, and thank you so much for listening, guys. And we will see you later.
Adios.
That's all for this week, folks. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a rating and review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you might be listening to this.
And if you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and the bell icon as well. That way you'll get notified each week as we upload new episodes.
If you have a comment about the podcast, or if you have a question for us to use to springboard a future conversation, please email us at hi@itsonlyupfromhere.com.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful week. And don't forget, it's only up from here.